In 1872, long before shopping malls, long before Amazon, and long before even most Americans trusted buying goods without seeing them first, a traveling dry goods salesman named Montgomery Ward saw a problem that most urban retailers ignored. Rural America was being overcharged. Farm families across the Midwest depended on small-town general stores for nearly everything: tools, clothing, fabric, household items. These stores often bought inventory through layers of wholesalers, each adding markup. By the time goods reached isolated farming communities, prices were inflated far beyond their original cost. Credit systems tied customers to local merchants who controlled both supply and pricing. Ward believed the railroads had changed that equation. By the early 1870s, the expanding railroad network connected Chicago to thousands of rural towns. Chicago had become one of the largest wholesale markets in the country. Ward realized that if he could buy directly from manufacturers in bulk and ship products by rail straight to customers, he could eliminate middlemen entirely. He started small. With $1,600 in capital pooled from partners, Ward created a single-sheet price list offering goods at fixed cash prices. Customers mailed in orders. Goods were shipped by rail to the nearest station. Payment was required in advance, which reduced risk and eliminated dependency on credit. This was radical. Mail-order retail required trust. Customers could not touch or inspect items. They relied entirely on printed descriptions. To build confidence, Ward adopted a strict satisfaction guarantee. If customers were unhappy, they could return goods. In an era of inconsistent quality and limited consumer protection, this policy mattered. The catalog expanded quickly. What began as a simple list grew into a bound book containing illustrations, detailed descriptions, and fixed prices. By the 1880s, Montgomery Ward catalogs were circulating widely across the Midwest and Great Plains. The timing was precise. American agriculture was expanding westward. Millions of families were settling in regions far from established retail centers. For them, Montgomery Ward's catalog became more than a shopping tool. It was a connection to urban markets and broader consumer culture. By 1888, the company issued a 240-page catalog listing more than 10,000 items. Customers could order watches, plows, stoves, dresses, furniture, even entire pre-cut houses. The catalog became known informally as the Wish Book. Competition followed. In 1893, Richard Warren Sears entered the mail-order market. Sears used aggressive marketing language and installment credit plans to attract customers. The rivalry between Montgomery Ward and Sears would define mail-order retail for decades. Ward remained disciplined in its cash-only philosophy longer than many competitors. Management believed avoiding credit reduced financial risk and protected margins. That conservatism strengthened the balance sheet during downturns, but also limited flexibility as consumer credit became more common. By the early 1900s, Montgomery Ward had established massive distribution facilities in Chicago. The company's headquarters complex along the Chicago River became one of the largest commercial structures in the world at the time. Warehouses were organized to process thousands of daily orders. Rail sidings connected directly to shipping platforms, minimizing handling time. Operational scale was central to Ward's advantage. Purchasing agreements were negotiated directly with manufacturers. Volume commitments lowered per-unit costs. Standardized packaging and centralized distribution reduced inefficiencies that plagued smaller retailers. In 1904, Montgomery Ward reported sales exceeding $40 million, a significant figure for mail-order commerce at the time. By 1910, it operated regional distribution centers to accelerate delivery times across the country. The catalog's influence extended beyond economics. It standardized consumer expectations. Rural households gained access to urban fashions and manufactured goods previously unavailable locally. The mail-order model democratized consumption, narrowing the gap between city and countryside. Unlike department stores concentrated in major cities, Montgomery Ward's customer base was geographically dispersed. This diversification protected the company from localized downturns. Crop failures in one region did not eliminate national demand. During the early 20th century, Ward faced regulatory and logistical challenges. Parcel post reforms in 1913 significantly improved shipping efficiency, benefiting mail-order firms. Rather than resist these changes, Ward integrated them into its distribution system, reducing costs further. By World War I, Montgomery Ward had become one of the largest retailers in the United States. Its brand represented reliability and scale. The catalog reached millions of homes annually, yet even during this ascent, structural questions were emerging. Mail order depended heavily on rail networks and predictable shipping timelines. It also relied on printed media in an era before electronic communication. As urban populations grew and consumer habits evolved, brick-and-mortar retail began modernizing rapidly. For decades, Montgomery Ward dominated rural commerce. But America was industrializing, urbanizing, and consolidating. The very innovation that built the company would eventually face competition from new retail models that operated closer to customers rather than through catalogs alone. For now, though, in the early 1900s, Montgomery Ward was not just surviving. It was reshaping how Americans bought nearly everything. By 1912, the company employed thousands of workers inside its Chicago facilities alone. Order clerks processed handwritten forms arriving by mail each day in sacks delivered by rail. Products moved through a coordinated system of receiving, storage, packing, and outbound shipment that resembled an early industrial assembly line. Efficiency was not accidental, it was engineered. Time studies were conducted to reduce handling delays, and inventory placement inside warehouses was organized to minimize travel distance for workers pulling orders. Leadership structure also matured during this period. While Aaron Montgomery Ward remained closely associated with the company's founding philosophy, operational control increasingly shifted to professional managers trained in accounting and logistics. This transition reflected a broader trend in American business, where founder-led enterprises evolved into structured corporations capable of national scale. Sales figures continued climbing into the 1910s and 1920s. By 1920, annual revenues exceeded $150 million, positioning Montgomery Ward among the largest retail organizations in the country. The catalog grew thicker, with expanded sections dedicated to ready-made clothing, agricultural machinery, musical instruments, and even automobiles sold through affiliated manufacturers. The rivalry with Sears intensified during this period. Sears adopted installment credit more aggressively, allowing customers to purchase goods without full upfront payment. Ward's management debated similar strategies but remained cautious, concerned about default risk and administrative burden. That conservative approach preserved financial stability during volatile economic cycles, but ceded some market share to competitors willing to extend credit. The 1920s also marked Montgomery Ward's first major strategic shift beyond pure mail order. Recognizing that urban populations were growing rapidly, the company began opening physical retail stores in cities. This decision represented a departure from its rural-first model. Executives believed combining catalog distribution with storefront presence would strengthen brand recognition and diversify revenue streams. The first retail stores opened in 1926. Expansion followed quickly. By the end of the decade, hundreds of Montgomery Ward department stores operated across major metropolitan areas. These stores offered broader assortments than traditional five-and-dime outlets, competing directly with established department chains. However, this expansion required significant capital investment. Real estate purchases, store construction, staffing, and inventory buildup increased fixed costs dramatically compared to the relatively asset-light mail-order model. The company that once relied on centralized warehouses now carried decentralized storefront obligations. When the Great Depression began in 1929, the timing proved consequential. Consumer spending collapsed nationwide. Department stores suffered heavy losses. Montgomery Ward's dual structure, mail order and physical retail, provided some diversification, but revenue declined sharply. Management responded by tightening inventory controls and reducing expansion. Unlike some competitors that overextended credit portfolios during the 1920s, Ward's conservative stance limited exposure to mass default. While profits contracted, the company avoided total collapse. During the 1930s, Montgomery Ward streamlined operations further. Distribution systems were refined. Advertising budgets were adjusted toward value messaging. The catalog emphasized affordability and practicality rather than luxury. Rural customers, still central to the company's base, continued ordering essentials. By the time World War II began, Montgomery Ward had solidified its place as a hybrid retailer, part mail-order pioneer, part department store operator. The company employed tens of thousands of workers nationwide. Its Chicago headquarters remained a symbol of scale, and its catalog circulation reached millions of households annually. Yet the seeds of future strain were visible even before the war ended. The retail environment was becoming more complex. Urban department stores faced rising labor costs. Suburban development patterns were beginning to reshape where Americans lived. Competitors were experimenting with new store formats that emphasized convenience, parking access, and expanded product lines under one roof. Montgomery Ward had proven that centralized purchasing and distribution could transform national commerce. It had challenged local merchant monopolies and standardized pricing for rural America. By the early 1940s, the company operated more than 600 retail stores in addition to its catalog business, and annual sales had climbed back above $500 million despite the economic turbulence of the 1930s. Its workforce numbered well over 60,000 employees nationwide, from warehouse laborers and rail coordinators to store managers and buyers negotiating contracts in Chicago. The operational complexity behind those numbers was significant. Each retail store required localized inventory forecasting, merchandising adjustments based on regional demand, and coordination with centralized procurement teams. Unlike the catalog model, which could pool demand nationally before purchasing, storefront retail required decentralized stock allocation. That meant higher inventory carrying costs and greater exposure to unsold goods. As product assortments widened in the late 1930s, markdown pressure increased. Ward's buyers were skilled at sourcing, but the cost discipline that worked in mail order became harder to enforce across hundreds of physical locations. The company also faced growing labor organization. Retail employees in urban centers increasingly joined unions demanding standardized wages and improved working conditions. Management had historically prioritized cost control, and negotiations were often tense. During wartime production constraints in the early 1940s, supply shortages intensified pressure on both warehouse throughput and retail staffing. Government rationing programs forced retailers to track controlled goods carefully, adding administrative overhead that mail-order systems were not originally designed to handle. At the same time, consumer expectations were shifting again. Wartime savings accumulated in American households as spending options narrowed. Once the war ended, that pent-up demand would surge into the market. Retailers positioned to capture it would need modern stores, updated merchandising strategies, and streamlined distribution systems capable of rapid replenishment. Montgomery Ward entered this period with substantial assets, brand recognition built over 70 years, nationwide logistics infrastructure, a hybrid retail model, and significant real estate holdings. Yet those assets were tied to structures designed decades earlier. The Chicago headquarters complex, though impressive, represented centralized control in an economy becoming increasingly decentralized. Store fleets expanded, but not always in the fastest-growing suburban corridors. Decision-making authority remained concentrated at the top, slowing adaptation at the local level. Financially, Ward remained stable through the early 1940s, but margins tightened. Mail order growth plateaued as rural electrification and road expansion reduced geographic isolation. Customers who once depended on catalogs could now drive to nearby towns with expanding retail options. The catalog still generated millions of orders annually, yet its growth rate no longer matched earlier decades. By the mid-1940s, Montgomery Ward stood at a structural crossroads. It was no longer just a mail-order pioneer, it was a large, diversified retail corporation operating in an economy about to experience unprecedented suburban growth, consumer credit expansion, and competitive innovation. The next strategic decisions would determine whether the company's scale remained an advantage or became a burden embedded in outdated systems. By 1946 and 1947, internal reports reflected both optimism and strain. Catalog circulation surpassed 15 million copies annually, and print runs required large paper contracts at a time when material costs were rising. Paper alone became a major line item in operating expenses. Distribution planning teams had to forecast not only merchandise demand, but also printing volume months in advance. A miscalculation meant wasted inventory or excess unsold catalogs. Post-war consumer demand initially surged. Appliance sales rose sharply as households upgraded to electric refrigerators, washing machines, and radios. Montgomery Ward benefited from this demand through its established supplier relationships. However, appliance retail required showroom space and technical service networks. Competitors investing more heavily in in-store demonstration areas began capturing higher-margin sales. Ward's store layouts, designed earlier for broad merchandise exposure, required renovation to compete effectively in these categories. Between 1946 and 1950, the company expanded its store base cautiously, adding locations in growing metropolitan regions. Yet, expansion strategy often prioritized markets with existing brand familiarity rather than aggressively pursuing newly built suburban corridors. Real estate acquisition decisions were influenced by historical performance metrics rather than forward-looking demographic migration patterns. This conservative positioning reduced immediate risk but limited long-term growth alignment with population shifts. Internally, administrative layers increased. As the organization grew, decision approval processes lengthened. Buyers, regional managers, and central executives coordinated through formal reporting channels that slowed response time compared to newer competitors operating with flatter structures. In retail, speed of adaptation can determine margin preservation. Delayed assortment changes meant missed seasonal opportunities and excess markdowns. Financial statements from the late 1940s showed stable revenue but tightening operating margins relative to total sales. Distribution costs rose with fuel price fluctuations. Store payroll expenses increased as wage standards climbed nationally. The hybrid model that once diversified risk now required continuous capital allocation to two separate operating engines: print-based mail order and real estate-intensive storefront retail. By 1950, Montgomery Ward remained one of America's largest retailers, yet the environment around it had transformed. Suburban housing developments multiplied along new highway systems. Consumers increasingly combined shopping trips with automobile travel, rather than relying on rail-linked town centers. Retailers that optimized for parking capacity, accessibility, and rapid inventory turnover positioned themselves for the next phase of American commerce. Within Montgomery Ward's leadership, discussions intensified about modernization of warehouse automation and potential adoption of emerging inventory control technologies. Early experiments with mechanized sorting systems were considered but required significant upfront investment. Capital budgeting debates reflected tension between preserving dividend stability and funding structural upgrades. The company had built its reputation on disciplined purchasing, national reach, and operational scale. Those strengths still existed. What was changing was the pace of competition and the economics of distribution. The systems that once eliminated rural markups were now competing in a marketplace where scale alone was no longer rare. Adaptation would require more than incremental adjustments to a model designed for an earlier century. Target length, approximately 9,500 characters. World War II placed Montgomery Ward in a position that tested more than its logistics. It tested its leadership culture and public standing. By the early 1940s, the company operated hundreds of retail stores alongside its still powerful catalog division. Annual sales were strong relative to the Depression years, but wartime controls reshaped supply chains across the country. Rationing programs limited access to rubber, metal, gasoline, and consumer durables. Retailers were required to comply with federal allocation systems. For a company built on centralized purchasing and bulk procurement, these restrictions complicated forecasting and replenishment. Merchandise planning became constrained by federal priorities rather than consumer demand. Labor tensions intensified during this period. Sewell Avery, who had become president of Montgomery Ward in the 1930s, was known for his rigid opposition to union concessions. As union activity increased nationwide during wartime industrial expansion, Ward resisted signing certain agreements. In 1944, after prolonged dispute, the federal government seized the company's Chicago facilities to prevent disruption of essential distribution operations. The image of Avery being carried from his office by soldiers circulated widely in newspapers. The incident damaged the company's public image. Retail depends on trust and reputation. Being associated with federal seizure during wartime created perception risks that extended beyond internal management disputes. After 1945, the American retail environment changed faster than at any previous time in the company's history. Suburbanization accelerated dramatically. Between 1945 and 1960, millions of families relocated from dense urban centers to newly developed suburbs. Shopping patterns followed residential migration. Montgomery Ward's store network had grown, but many locations were concentrated in older downtown districts. Suburban shopping centers increasingly demanded large anchor tenants capable of drawing steady traffic. While Ward did open suburban branches, its expansion pace did not match the geographic shift in consumer density. The catalog, once the company's core engine, faced structural erosion. Rural isolation declined as highways expanded and automobile ownership increased. Customers who once relied on mail-order purchasing could now drive to physical stores, offering immediate access to goods. Delivery waiting periods felt outdated in a convenience-driven era. During the 1950s, annual revenues continued climbing in nominal terms, exceeding $1 billion by mid-decade. However, revenue growth masked margin compression. Operating costs rose as store fleets expanded. Inventory management complexity increased. The company's hybrid model required maintaining both print distribution infrastructure and large-scale retail staffing. Competitors modernized more aggressively. Sears expanded suburban mall presence and invested heavily in merchandising systems. Department store chains refined visual presentation and in-store experience. Meanwhile, new discount retailers began experimenting with large format stores offering aggressive pricing, supported by leaner cost structures. By the early 1960s, discount retail began reshaping American commerce. Walmart and Kmart were founded in 1962. Their model emphasized centralized distribution, tight cost control, and suburban accessibility. These chains did not carry the legacy burden of older downtown real estate or extensive catalog printing operations. Montgomery Ward attempted strategic adjustments. Store layouts were updated incrementally. Merchandise assortments were revised to emphasize appliances, home goods, and apparel categories where brand recognition remained strong. However, technological modernization lagged. Competitors implemented early computerized inventory tracking and barcode systems during the 1970s. Ward's systems remained comparatively slower to adapt. In 1976, Mobil Corporation acquired Montgomery Ward in a leveraged transaction valued at approximately $1.8 billion. The acquisition reflected a broader trend of industrial conglomerates diversifying into retail. Under Mobil ownership, profitability targets tightened. Retail, however, requires sustained reinvestment in merchandising cycles, store refreshes, and supply chain optimization. Capital allocation under Mobil prioritized financial discipline. Large-scale modernization projects were delayed or selectively implemented. Distribution infrastructure upgrades competed with shareholder return expectations. As discount competitors expanded rapidly across suburban America, Ward's store base aged relative to peers. By the early 1980s, revenues exceeded $2 billion annually, yet competitive position weakened. Same-store sales growth slowed. Inventory turnover lagged industry leaders. Promotional pricing increased, compressing gross margins. The catalog division, still substantial, faced declining response rates as suburban retail density increased. In 1988, Mobil divested Montgomery Ward to an investor group led by Robert Campeau in a highly leveraged buyout. The acquisition placed significant debt on the company's balance sheet. Interest obligations constrained flexibility at precisely the moment retail competition intensified. Servicing acquisition debt required consistent cash flow. However, discount retailers with lower cost structures continued capturing market share. Ward faced the dual pressure of declining competitive differentiation and rising financial leverage. Operationally, the company struggled to define its identity. It was neither the lowest-cost retailer nor a premium department store. Appliance sales, once a strong category, faced competition from specialty electronics chains and warehouse-style outlets. Apparel struggled against fast-moving fashion competitors. Home goods faced pricing pressure from emerging big-box formats. By the end of the 1980s, the structural challenges were clear. High fixed costs tied to aging real estate, leveraged balance sheets from acquisition financing, slower technology adoption, and brand positioning caught between discount and department store formats. The infrastructure that once powered national dominance now required reinvention under financial constraint. As the United States approached recessionary conditions in the early 1990s, Montgomery Ward entered the decade carrying strategic and financial burdens accumulated over years of incremental adaptation rather than decisive transformation. Target length, approximately 9,000 characters. By the mid-1950s, the structural shift that had been building quietly for years became measurable. Population growth was no longer centered in traditional downtown districts, where Montgomery Ward had built much of its retail footprint. Suburban counties expanded faster than urban cores, fueled by highway construction, mortgage subsidies, and automobile ownership. Retail followed rooftops. Between 1950 and 1960, suburban shopping centers more than tripled in number across the United States. These centers were designed for car access, large parking lots, and anchor tenants capable of generating steady traffic. Sears secured prime positions in many of these developments early, locking in long leases and building new format stores designed for appliance display, tool departments, and broad merchandise layouts tailored to suburban families. Montgomery Ward expanded into some suburban centres, but its capital commitments were more restrained. Many existing stores required renovation to compete visually and operationally with newer retail environments. Renovation required cash, simultaneously maintaining a national catalogue programme. Aging downtown properties and selective suburban builds stretched available investment funds. Operationally, the company still relied heavily on centralized buying decisions in Chicago. Merchandise planning cycles were longer than those emerging among discount competitors experimenting with faster inventory turnover. Ward's historic strength had been national-scale purchasing. Appliance and home goods sales remained meaningful, but competitors invested more aggressively in supplier integration and pricing optimization. The catalog division also faced structural erosion during this period. Improved road networks and rising car ownership reduced the advantage of mail-order delivery to rural communities. Debt servicing obligations limited reinvestment capacity at precisely the moment large-scale transformation would have required significant capital infusion. Operational complexity, financial leverage, and competitive pressure converged as the decade progressed. Management teams explored turnaround strategies, including category specialization and further store rationalization. Yet the underlying economics of the retail landscape had shifted decisively toward operators built around scale efficiency, advanced logistics, and clearly defined market positioning. The stage was set for a financial reckoning that would move beyond gradual decline and into formal restructuring proceedings. By 1996, the financial strain could no longer be managed through incremental restructuring. Losses had accumulated across consecutive quarters. Vendor confidence weakened. Credit terms tightened. The leverage placed on the company during the 1988 buyout constrained nearly every strategic option. In 1997, Montgomery Ward filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. At the time, it operated hundreds of stores nationwide and employed tens of thousands of workers. The filing was presented as an opportunity to reorganize operations, reduce debt, and reposition the business for long-term viability. During the bankruptcy process, the company announced plans to close more than 100 underperforming stores. Inventory was liquidated in multiple regions. Distribution centers were consolidated. Workforce reductions affected corporate offices and store-level employees alike. The goal was to shrink into a more focused, appliance-centered retail model, emphasizing categories where Ward historically retained brand recognition. Appliances and electronics became the centerpiece of the restructuring strategy. Management believed concentrating on these higher-margin durable goods could differentiate the company from general merchandise discounters. Marketing campaigns were adjusted to highlight appliance expertise and service capabilities. However, the competitive environment had evolved significantly. Home Depot and Lowe's dominated home improvement and appliance categories with large warehouse formats. Best Buy captured consumer electronics with specialized inventory and vendor partnerships. Walmart expanded aggressively into appliances at price points difficult to match. The restructuring reduced debt obligations temporarily, but it did not resolve structural disadvantages in logistics efficiency or brand positioning. Store footprints remained larger and more expensive than discount competitors. Modernization efforts required capital at a time when lenders remained cautious. In 1998 and 1999, management attempted additional strategic pivots. Credit programs were revised. Merchandise assortments were narrowed further. Private label branding initiatives were introduced in selected categories. Yet customer traffic trends continued downward in many markets. Financial disclosures during the late 1990s revealed persistent operating losses. Sales declined year over year. Comparable store performance lagged industry averages. Vendor relationships grew more fragile as payment cycles extended under cash flow pressure. By 2000, liquidity constraints intensified. Holiday season performance failed to generate sufficient recovery. On December 28, 2000, Montgomery Ward announced it would cease operations and liquidate remaining stores. The decision ended nearly 129 years of continuous retail presence. Liquidation sales unfolded across hundreds of locations. Fixtures, inventory, and warehouse assets were auctioned. Tens of thousands of employees lost jobs in one of the largest retail closures in American history at the time. The Chicago headquarters complex that once symbolized mail-order dominance stood as a reminder of a different retail era. The final collapse was not caused by a single catastrophic decision. It was the cumulative result of structural inertia, leveraged financial engineering, delayed technological modernization, and ambiguous market positioning in an increasingly polarized retail landscape. Montgomery Ward's original competitive advantage had been scale through centralized distribution and direct manufacturer purchasing. Over time, scale became common across the industry. What differentiated competitors in the late 20th century was logistics precision, real-time inventory analytics, suburban geographic alignment, and clearly defined brand identity. The company's catalog legacy faded quietly. Printing operations ceased. The wish book, once a fixture in millions of homes, disappeared from mailboxes.